4. French civilization. Judging by the way in which Marx usually worked, it is very probable that he had already drafted the two contributions to the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbuch, at least in their fundamentals, while he was still in Germany, very likely during the first few months of his happy marriage, as the ideas contained in them turned on the Great French Revolution. Nothing was more natural than that he should plunge into the study of the history of this revolution as soon as his presence in Paris gave him an opportunity of exploring its sources, and also the sources of its predecessor, French materialism, and of its successor, French socialism. Paris at that time could justly claim that it was in the van of bourgeois civilization. After a series of illusions and catastrophes, the French bourgeoisie had finally secured in the July Revolution of 1830 that which it had begun in the Great Revolution of 1789. Its forces were now relaxing comfortably, although the resistance of the old powers had by no means been completely broken, and new powers were beginning to make themselves felt. The result was that a ceaseless battle of intellects raged, rolling now here, now there, such as could be found nowhere else in Europe and certainly not in Germany, which lay motionless in the silence of intellectual death. Marx now plunged into this rejuvenating flood. In 1844 Rouhet wrote to Feuerbach informing him that Marx was reading a tremendous amount and working with unusual intensity. However, he finished nothing, broke off his work constantly and plunged again and again into an endless sea of books. He was irritable and violent, particularly when he had worked himself sick and had not been to bed for 3 or 4 nights in succession. He had put his criticism of Hegelian philosophy on the shelf in order to utilize his stay in Paris to write a history of the convention. Having already collected the necessary material and adopted a number of very fruitful viewpoints, the evidence of this letter is all the more valuable because it was written in no commendatory sense. Marx did not write a history of the convention, but this fact does not disprove the information of Rouhet. On the contrary, it makes it rather more credible if anything. The deeper Marx penetrated into the historic significance of the Revolution of 1789, the easier it became for him to dispense with a criticism of the Hegelian philosophy as a means of arriving at a clear view of the struggles and demands of the age. However, the history of the convention alone could not satisfy him because, although it represented a maximum of political energy, political power and political understanding, it had proved itself impotent in the face of social anarchy. Apart from the meager indications of Rouhet, there is unfortunately no evidence to assist us in following in detail the course of study Marx pursued in the spring and summer of 1844. However, the general way in which his studies developed can be seen. The study of the French Revolution led him on to the historical literature of the Third Estate, a literature which originated under the Bourbon Restoration and was developed by men of great historical talent who followed the historical existence of their class back into the 11th century, and presented French history as an uninterrupted series of class struggles. Marx owes his knowledge of the historical nature of the classes and their struggles to these historians. He mentions in particular Guizot and Thierry, and he then proceeded to study the economic anatomy of the classes from the bourgeois economists, mentioning Ricardo in particular. Marx always denied having originated the theory of the class struggle. What he claimed as his contribution was having supplied proof that the existence of the classes was bound to definite historical struggles in the development of production, that the class struggle necessarily led to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that this dictatorship was only a transitional period leading to the complete abolition of the classes and the establishment of a classless society. This series of ideas developed during his stay in Paris. The most brilliant and most trenchant weapon used by the Third Estate in its struggle against the ruling classes in the 18th century was the philosophy of materialism. During his exile in Paris, Marx zealously studied this philosophy, but less the branch represented by Descartes, which developed into natural science, than the branch which proceeded from Locke and developed into social science. Other stars which hung over the Paris studies of the young Marx were Helvetius and Holbach, who carried materialism into social life and who presented as chief points in their system the natural equality of human intellects, the essential unity between the progress of reason and the progress of industry, the natural goodness of humanity, and the omnipotent power of education. He called their teachings real humanism, as he had called Feuerbach's philosophy, the difference being that the materialism of Helvetius and Holbach had become the social basis of communism. Paris now offered him all the opportunities he needed for studying communism and socialism, as he had promised in the Renaissance. The intellectual world which he had entered in Paris was dazzling, almost confusing in its richness of ideas and forms. The intellectual atmosphere of Paris was pregnant with the germs of socialism, and even the journal des Debates, the traditional organ of the ruling finance oligarchy, which was in receipt of a considerable government subsidy annually, was unable to hold itself completely aloof from the spirit of the day. Though it did no more than publish Eugene Sue's socialist thrillers in its feuilleton columns, the opposing camp contained such brilliant thinkers as Leroux, men who were now being produced by the proletariat. Between the hostile camps were the remnants of the Saint-Simonists and the active Fourierist sect led by Considerant, whose organ was the Démocratie Pacifique. Christian socialists like the Catholic priest Lomonet and the former Carbonaro Bucas, petty bourgeois socialists like Sismondi, Buret, Piqueur, and Vidal, whilst even in Bell's Lettres magnificent productions, such as the Songs of Béranger and the novels of George Sand, brilliantly reflected socialist ideas and problems. The common characteristic of all these socialist systems was that they all reckoned on the goodwill and the reasonableness of the possessing classes whom they hoped to convince by peaceful propaganda of the necessity of social reforms or revolution. They were all born out of the disappointments of the Great Revolution, and they disdained the political path which had resulted in these disappointments. They desired to assist the suffering masses because the latter were unable to assist themselves. The insurrections of the workers in the 30s had failed, and even their most determined leaders, men like Barbès and Blanqui, knew nothing of any socialist theory or of any definite practical means for achieving a social revolution. Notwithstanding, the working class movement grew all the more rapidly, and with the prophetic eye of the poet, Heinrich Heine sketched the problem which arose in the following words. The Communists represent the only party in France deserving of respect. I should feel the same way about the remnants of the Saint-Simonists perhaps, who still exist under strange banners, or about the Fourierists, who are still alive and active. But these good fellows are moved by the word only, by the social problem as a question of traditional concepts and not by any demoniacal necessity. They are not the servants predestined by the supreme world spirit to fulfill its tremendous decisions. Sooner or later the scattered army of Saint-Simon and the whole general staff of the Fourierists will go over to the growing army of communism, there to play the role of the fathers of the church, lending brutal necessity the creative word. Thus Heine on June 15, 1843. And within the year the man arrived in Paris who was to play the role Heine thought the Saint-Simonists and the Fourierists might play. He lent brutal necessity the creative word. In all probability whilst he was still in Germany, and in any case whilst his standpoint was still predominantly philosophic, Marx had declared himself against cut-and-dried systems for the future, against any attempt to settle all problems for all time, against the unfurling of any dogmatic standard, and against the idea of the crass socialists that political questions were beneath their dignity. And if he had declared it not enough that the idea should press forward to reality, but that reality must become the idea, this condition fulfilled itself before his eyes. Since the last insurrection of the workers in 1839 the working class movement and socialism had begun to approach each other in three ways. First of all there was the Democratic Socialist Party. Its socialism was not of any very great import because it was composed of lower middle class and proletarian elements and because the slogans which it inscribed on its banners, the organization of labor and the right to work, were nothing but lower middle class utopias impossible of fulfillment in capitalist society. The latter organizes labor as it must be organized, namely, as wage labor, and this presupposes the existence of capital and can be abolished only along with it. While the situation with regard to the right to work is no different. Such a right can be fulfilled only in the joint ownership of the means of production, that is to say, by the abolition of bourgeois society, but the leaders of this party, Louis Blanc, Ledru Rollin and Ferdinand Flocon, solemnly refused to lay the axe to the roots of bourgeois society, declaring that they were neither communists nor socialists. However, although the social aims of this party were completely utopian, it nevertheless represented a great step forward because it chose the political path for their realization. It declared that no social reform was possible without political reform, and that the conquest of political power was the only means by which the suffering masses could save themselves. And therefore it demanded the general franchise, a demand which met with a lively echo in the ranks of the proletariat, which was tired of putches and conspiracies, and sought more effective weapons for the prosecution of the class struggle. Still greater masses of the workers rallied to the banner of proletarian communism unfurled by Cabet. who had originally been a Jacobin and was later converted to communism by his reading and in particular by the Utopia of Sir Thomas More. Cabet professed communism as openly as the Democratic Socialist Party rejected it, but he agreed with the latter that political democracy was a necessary transitional stage. Thus the Journey to Ikaria, in which Cabet attempted to describe the society of the future, became an incomparably more popular work than the brilliant fantasies of Fourier, although the narrow limits of Cabet's work made it immeasurably inferior to the genius of the former. And finally, voices began to sound loud and clear within the ranks of the proletariat itself, indicating beyond a doubt that it was beginning to emerge from its infancy. Marx was acquainted with Leroux and Proudhon, both of whom were printers and members of the working class, from the days of the Renaissance, and he had already promised to study their works thoroughly. Their works appealed to him because both men sought to harness the results of German philosophy to their own aims, although both of them fell victim to serious misunderstandings. Marx himself has informed us that he spent many hours, often throughout the night, trying to explain Hegelian philosophy to Proudhon. The two men came together for a while only to part soon afterwards. But writing after Proudhon's death, Marx readily bore witness to the great impetus which Proudhon's first appearance gave to the working class movement, an impetus, in fact, which certainly affected Marx also. Marx regarded Proudhon's first work as the first scientific manifesto of the modern proletariat. All these tendencies helped to prepare the way for a unification between the working class movement and socialism, but they were all in contradiction with each other. And after the first few steps they involved themselves in new contradictions. Marx had studied socialism and he now began to study the proletariat. In July, 1844, Rouhet wrote to a friend in Germany, "Marx has plunged into German communism here, socially, I mean, for he can hardly consider the dismal affair of any political importance. Germany can stand the minor damage the artisans are likely to do without much doctoring." Rouhet was soon to discover why Marx took the meager handful of artisans and their doings seriously.